Hi everyone and welcome. I would just like to acknowledge that I am on the unceded lands of the Wurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations here in Melbourne. Thanks to Ben and Beatriz for organising this conference, and to Ariadna, who's going to give the talk. I would just like to welcome everyone in my capacity as chair of the AHSN board. If anyone doesn't already know about the network, we've been around since 1996, and as well as conferences and lots of other things that we do, this webinar series that Ben basically organises is about one a year, and very happy to be able to welcome you to this today. I will just put the website link in the chat for everyone, and with that I will pass over to Beatriz and Ben.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thanks very much, Carrie. Oh, and quickly, Carrie, once more, where can people find out more about the network and the online presence? Maybe quickly say it one more time.
Yep, there is a website, and I've just put the link in the chat, so you can find out about all the resources. We have an annual conference, and we have a newsletter as well. So if you're not already subscribed to the newsletter, then please do. If you go to that main website, then you'll see all of the sub tabs that will give you all the information you need.
Thanks very much, Beatriz.
Thank you. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm joining from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation and unceded land, and I would like to invite you to also let us know in the audience where you're joining us from. So I'll introduce now our guest speaker for today, Dr. Ariadna Matamoros-Fernández. She researches social video cultures, platform governance, online harms, and algorithmic systems. She's a senior lecturer in digital media at Queensland University of Technology, a chief investigator at the Digital Media Research Centre, and associate investigator at the National ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society. She's also an Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Research Fellow. And her DECRA project examines harmful humor impact on women's well-being online, how it is poorly managed by social media platform and has not been integrated into online safety regulation and policy. The project brings together sociocultural theory, social media analysis, and interviews to better understand the dynamics of harmful humor online in Australia. Ariadna holds degrees in journalism from the Autonomous University of Barcelona, a Master of New Media and Digital Culture from the University of Amsterdam, a PhD from the Queensland University of Technology, and her doctoral thesis examined the interplay between user practices, platform design, and governance in reproducing structural inequality, reproducing and producing structural inequality. Her research has been published in New Media and Society, Information, Communication and Society, Feminist Media Studies, Internet Policy Review, and other international peer-reviewed journals. She's co-author of a book on WhatsApp with Politi, with Amelia Jones and Elma Bolt. And with that brief introduction, over to you, Ariadna, if you'd like to add any more or just start with your presentation. Welcome.
Thanks a lot for this kind presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if, can you see it well, my slides? Yeah. Great, perfect. So first of all, I would like also to start with an acknowledgement of the Turrbal and the Yugara as the First Nations owners of the lands where I now stand, and pay my respects to the elders, lords, customs, and creation spirits, and recognize that these lands were never ceded, and they've always been a place of learning, teaching, and research. So it's really nice to see in the audience familiar faces, especially from QUT. So thanks, guys, for attending this seminar. The way that I will that I've structured this talk is really general about why I think that humor should be taken seriously for online safety. This is the first part. And the second part that Ben asked me to talk about a bit about my DECRA and what I'm doing. I'm starting my second year. In March, I started the second year of my DECRA. And actually, the research is ongoing, but I will give you an overview of the different things that I'm doing. So when I talk about humor, I talk about in general about the act of kind of making a mockery of seriousness, but I'm interested in different humorous genres like parody, satire, comedy, TikTok challenges, memes. All these genres are really important in my research to really understand how people engage with humor online and how platforms moderate this form of expression. And in my research, it's really important, especially for those of you that are not really familiar with platform governance or content moderation. The way that I looked at harmful humor is within this, what Tracy Cho says, that it's kind of the messy spectrum of online speech, right? Because platforms not only moderate illegal content, that it's content that is illegal in relation to national laws, and then states can ask platforms to take down content, but also content that it's legal, but it's not allowed on platforms because of the terms of services, right? And here we have hateful conduct and some kind of doxing and other things that are not allowed, but are not necessarily illegal. But also platforms moderate speech and conduct that it's legal, that it is allowed on platforms, but that it's kind of awful and users don't want to see it. So platforms have policies, really vague policies around borderline content. And when people complain, then they can demote specific, for instance, on TikTok, specific TikTok challenges. But it's very blurry and it's not really systematic the way that they do this. And then obviously we have everything else. And when I think about harmful humor, it's in between this idea of content that in some platforms is not allowed according to their terms of services, like digital blackface on Facebook and other types of harmful stereotypes, but other platforms don't have really policies that really make the connection between humor and harm, but nonetheless sometimes react to this, to some kind of content like TikTok, when there are TikTok challenges that are harmful and are humorous, and then they moderate it. But if you go to their policies on TikTok, it's not really clear, the connection between humor and harm. And it's important because to look at humor, I would argue, for 5 main reasons, and I've just listed them here. The first one is that bad actors use humor a lot online to cloak hate, right? So we have research from different scholars telling us, from men's rights groups online, from the alt-right, how they use humor to recruit new members, to socialize, and to dehumanize, especially historically marginalized groups. So there are a lot of civil society organizations that are saying that platforms really need to engage with these particularly complex issues in online hate, including humor and irony. So that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in looking at humor online. The second one, that it's most of my research, it's around this area, is that when humor can harm beyond coming from a position of hate, right? So there's a challenge online that sometimes we unreflexively contribute or engage with mimetic practices that are harmful, but we don't realize so, right? And TikTok is just a platform that it's really easy to observe this dynamic, because there are challenges that trivialize police brutality, that trivialize violence against women. And if you would ask some of the participants of this challenge, they would not really understand that this is necessarily harmful, right? So there's work to do in terms of literacy around humor and literacy around when humor harms on social media platforms. The third reason why I'm interested in humor online and how to moderate it is because there's, when we want to understand and moderate humor online, it takes another dimension that offline on platforms. And there's a platform specificity to it. So if you look at YouTube, that Lucinda is in the audience, that she does work on like misogyny and social media platforms. A lot of the like misogyny, like cloaked in humor that happens on YouTube, it's because content on YouTube, there's a really like clear monetization scheme, right? So people would engage with misogynistic humor related to the everyday news just to get money, right? So this is something that it's really unique to YouTube, and it's not that much in other platforms that they don't have monetization schemes as clear. I've done research on TikTok, and on TikTok, the sounds are really important in the way that people mimetically engage in humorous challenges, right? So it's a bit different to all the studies that have been done until now about the visual elements of memes, that also in TikTok, obviously you have the video, but there's a sound component there with racial stereotyping in the case of this research that I'm showing in the screen, that it's quite important if we want to understand humor and also what to do about it when people start engaging with harmful stereotypes through sounds, right? And also online, part of the platform specificity is that the other technological affordances like algorithms, it give another dimension to like expression with the potential to harm because of the amplification that these systems give to different forms of expression through their algorithms, for instance. So that's another reason why it's important to study humor online. And it's also important because most of the time, the systems that moderate content are automated. If you look at the latest transparency reports for the Digital Services Act that the platforms provided to the European Commission, you will see that a lot of the content moderation is automated. And what happens when you try to automate like the moderation of humor is that these systems don't understand humor. And then you have cases like the one that I'm showing here, is that, for instance, the Wiggles like responded to Matt Canavan that complained that they were being super woke with being sexually diverse characters, saying that they had a character that it's the Ku Klux Klan that perhaps would represent better Matt Canavan, right? So what happened is that Facebook took down the page because probably either a human moderator or algorithms recognize the hate sign in the Ku Klux Klan like costume, and then this post was taken down because they didn't understand the joke. So its satire is really difficult to understand for these systems. And then we have another example of how online, if we don't understand humor, then it can end up limiting like the expression of satires or even like the expressions of marginalized groups that a lot of time appropriate slurs or just humor in a way that platforms won't understand and take down, right? So that's important, as like a lot of researchers have documented. And this also happens with hate speech. So it's a common thing that also with hate speech, when we try to automate the moderation of hate speech, we end up like limiting the expression of marginalized groups. And it's the same with humor, right? So some forms of humor coming from communities can be considered hate speech and then taken down. So that's another reason why having more humor literacy, it's important for my research. And the last reason is that we are in a moment where a lot of states and supranational entities are passing online harms regulation, right? So they want platforms to improve the way that they are moderating content. In Australia, it's the online safety bill. It's mainly focused on illegal content. But then we have other examples coming from the UK, although it was failed, and the Digital Services Act, that like the UK tried to kind of push platforms also to do better in the way that they were moderating legal but harmful content. But in the end, it was dismissed because of the fears of regulatory overreach. But you had a lot of civil society groups that said that this was a shame, and they advocated, like the Free Speech for All report that I'm showing here, that the need to include the legal but harmful, precisely because a lot of the harm that happens online is not necessarily through illegal content, but this legal content that it's harmful, including a lot of forms of humor. And the Digital Services Act has another approach. So they don't use the word legal but harmful, but they use this sentence of systemic risk. So they want platforms to really audit for systemic risk. And systemic risk could be like the undermining of fundamental rights like freedom of expression, non-discrimination, and privacy, right? So systemic risk, not only how specific content contribute to systemic risk, disinformation, especially in relation to elections, or disinformation in relation to health crisis, but also how platform systems contribute themselves to systemic risks. And it could be how algorithms contribute to discrimination, right? So it's interesting to follow what's happening in Europe around societal risk. And I would argue that humor is imbricated into this idea of systemic risk, especially humor in relation to disinformation, or humor related into hate campaigns or hateful campaigns. But the thing is that it's really difficult to identify, to understand, and to assess humor online, right? So it's not an easy task for platforms. And when you look at scholars that are looking at humor from a case law perspective, they are analyzing case law to really understand norm setting around humor by judges, right? They've documented that really the courts are struggling to assess when humor harms, because they don't understand the different genres of humor. Normally, they protect humor, and it should be like this, because humor as a form of artistic expression has exceptions into copyright law, and it's just it is protected in most of the Western legal systems. But the thing is that courts are not really good at understanding when humor can discriminate. And I will just talk a bit more about this, because this is what I'm interested in. So this idea, this begs the question around, okay, how can platforms moderate humor in a way that it's legitimate, right? So first of all, and I'm just giving this from people more familiar with legal studies, maybe this is super known, for other people maybe it's not, but it's important to explain it, because most of the platforms will say that they adhere to international human rights standards for content moderation, right? And as an example, under international human rights law, freedom of expression can be limited normally if the restrictions pass what they call a three-part test of legality, legitimacy, and proportionality, right? Legality means that, okay, you can interfere with freedom of expression if it's prescribed, this restriction, by the law, right? So the law needs to be clear about when we can restrict expression. And in most of the cases in terms of discrimination, or is when expression is like an overt threat, or when expression just makes a calls to violence, right? So we have certain laws that would be that this type of speech is illegal. Then we have legitimacy, and this is super important because, okay, what this three-part test says is that when there are reasons for limiting expression, they need to pursue a public interest objective. And this public interest could be protecting the rights of others or national security or public health. And a lot of times harm is used as an objective test, right? So this expression is causing a reputational harm for defamation law. Or this expression, this is in Europe, in the US, no, but it's just a harm to dignity, that for dignity in Europe. It's covered within like some of the legal systems of Western countries. So these are objective tests that are used to evaluate if it's legitimate to restrict like freedom of expression. And then this idea of proportionality also, right? So this is more when judges are making decisions around humor and other sorts of expression. So that it seems, okay, if we restrict expression, it really needs to be the less restricting means available, right? So it needs to be proportionate how we react. Now, if we move this to the online, right, with this in mind of legality, legitimacy, and proportionality, the way that platforms work, even though they are not states, for content moderation, if they have to restrict humor, actually, if we want it to be like this idea of legality will be, okay, platforms need to have in place rules. And these rules need to be clear about when humor harms and need to have like exceptions for when humor needs to be protected, right? So this is not that easy. It doesn't happen based on my research. And a lot of platforms could do much better in the way that they are accounting for how people communicate through humor online. Then at the time of content moderation of this idea of legitimacy, again, it's the same, right? So if like content moderators with the guidelines and what platforms say publicly, it should be clear how they are making these decisions, right? And I think that the public interest objective it still stands online, right? So it's protecting the rights of others, national security, public health is when they restrict humor. But like in my research, like the point that I'm making is that unlike the law, platforms have an opportunity for expansive conceptualizations of harm, right? So in a way that captures a lot of expression that it's not considered harmful from a legal standpoint by the law, but it's considered harmful by other disciplines. And most of the cases I'm looking at expression that targets historically marginalized groups, right? So I think that there's an opportunity there, and this is what I'm using for my research. And the third one, that there's another opportunity, is that platforms in a way are less rigid than the courts, right? So obviously some courts, like in civil law, you just like fine people and because they just for defamation and everything. But platforms with some types of humor that harms it doesn't need to take down that expression, but they could use different remedies that are more proportionate. They could use labels, they could educate users about like humor and harm. They could reduce the spread of some harmful challenges, obviously being transparent for the reason why they are doing so. So there are different remedies that they can apply. So that's why, like in terms of proportionality, there's also an opportunity to regulate better humor online, humor that harms, obviously. And this idea, if we think about objective harms, as I said, harm to dignity, this is more individualized harm to reputation. There's a scholarship that talks about, okay, there is a cumulative harm. There's a societal harm. So harms of stereotyping cultures would never be like considered by individualized conceptions of harm, right? It's more a societal harm. And this happens a lot, so trivializing violence against a community. This is more a societal harm. So some scholars, and if you look at, and I can talk more about this, but if you look at some of the resolutions of the Oversight Board on content that was like taken down on Facebook, they start mentioning this idea of cumulative harm. And I've done some analysis with Ofcom too, when they analyze cases related to humor, like the regulator in the UK, that also they've mentioned this idea of cumulative harm. So again, there's more possibilities within these like regulators and platforms that courts into like accounting for cumulative and societal harm. So I don't know if I have 10 more minutes to explain a bit like what I'm doing for the DECRA project, or because I think it's around 20 minutes that I've talked. Is it okay?
Right. Yeah, I mean, if that's okay with you, I was just suggesting maybe we could talk a bit about the DECRA, and then we can actually take that into the host questions a bit, if that's okay, for like a couple of minutes.
Perfect. So yeah, I think I will have 10 more minutes to present a bit what I'm doing for the DECRA. So with the DECRA, the more conceptual work has been done. Obviously, it will evolve, but I've just published these 3 papers that explain what I mean by when humor harms, taking humor seriously for online safety, and specifically the paper that Ben wanted to discuss today, that it's more a commentary of the taking humor seriously on TikTok, right? And the first thing that I'm looking at is norm setting around humor, right? That's what I'm interested in. Norm setting in terms of policy analysis of the different policies of social media platforms, how they just like conceptualize humor. Also like the online regulation that I've mentioned. I'm doing social media analysis in terms of how everyday users on social media make sense about humor, and I will say a bit more about this. And I'm doing interviews with different actors that are involved into what Gorwa calls the platform governance triangle. So platforms, states, in my case, that would be regulators, media regulators, and civil society organizations. I mean, it's more expanded because with platforms, it's not this triangle. Now that you have different other actors like companies that are offering trust and safety services that would be included in those that have a role to play in platform governance, but this is a way of simplifying it. And I'm just starting like to do the interviews with these different actors. And to give you an example of like the social media analysis that I'm doing, I'm looking at different like humor-related controversies. So what happened with Will Smith and Chris Rock, the joke about Jada, and then looking online across different social platforms about how people make sense of this humor. If it's really different to the normative standards that courts use and in the way that they reason when it's off limits, right? So in a way, I'm doing social media listening, like seeing how people make sense of it. And I'm using Reddit, for instance, and YouTube, different controversies. I've just mentioned the Oscars, but also when Little Britain was taken down from Netflix, but also the Ofcom, the UK regulator, just released a report based on questions with people from the UK saying if they thought that the racist, the stereotyping happening in Little Britain was okay or not, right? And how people reacted to this. Oh, is Little Britain racist or not? Then Matt Rife is a kind of a YouTuber and comedian that made a joke about trivializing domestic violence. Dave Chappelle about the transphobic jokes, and Trevor Noah here about like jokes targeting Aboriginal women. So in all this, you can see the number of comments that all these like videos have. And what I'm just trying to do is just try to use large language models to see how people position themselves into whether this is harmful or not harmful, and what people say that should be done about it. So this is ongoing work, but this is the type of thing that the large language models summarize, right? When they support specifics, I'm looking at specific Reddits, subreddits. So it's not the same what it's being discussed in a feminist subreddit than in a subreddit that is around the alt-right. And I'm just interested in knowing the differences about how people, when it's supportive or not supportive, about when humor is off limits. And this I can skip. The second thing that I'm doing is auditing processes and tools that are used to moderate humor on platforms, right? So what I said is not only the takedowns, it's just things about fact checking. So because fact checkers have also, like, they just need to fact check satire sometimes and parody and explain how it can be harmful for like disinformation campaigns. So with fact checking, I'm interviewing them, but also I'm looking at, any of you can request access to the fact checking sites. It's a database that they've just put together about a lot of claims that different fact checkers around the world have done in relation to content. And a lot of them are labeled as satire. So I'm analyzing this to see the reasons and how they relate, how they explain that this satire is problematic, right? And why it needed a fact check. And I've done work on the Twitter community notes with Nadia, that it's in the audience. And we've written a paper that is under review, again, about how Twitter community notes as a system that adds context to tweets. When these notes say that this is satire, also what kind of like norm setting or justification are the contributors of community notes saying about why this satire has the potential to harm or not, right? So these are tools. I don't know if you know what community notes are, but it's just like this public notes that appear under a tweet. If you use Twitter now, branded X anymore, probably most of you have left Twitter, but it's kind of a soft moderation tool that the platform is trialing and seeing if it works into contextualizing some content online. And it's open access, the Twitter community notes, so you can download it. And this is the paper that it's under review, right? So we just like really looked into the trends of, okay, how people make sense of humor through the community notes as a moderation tool. There's some work that I'm doing about using like this idea of automation and the system failure that I was talking about. So how like technologies like GPT-4 are just claiming that they are really good at understanding humor. So just using, through the interviews that I will do with women, some examples of this type of humor and using GPT-4 to make an assessment of it. And combining this with like instruments that are in place, like the oversight board, with the cases that concern humor, and seeing again the rationale behind the members of the oversight board when they say that it's okay to restrict humor, and when they say, no, this humor needs to be protected, and they contest some of Facebook's decisions around this, or Instagram.
Ariadna, I was wondering, maybe would it be okay, maybe just say 1 or 2 more minutes and then we transition to the next bit? Is that okay for you?
Yeah, it's just 2 more slides.
Perfect, thanks so much.
So, yeah. So it's the, with this idea of norm setting, I'm also looking at what like media institutions and regulators in Australia and also in the UK are doing. So similar of the work that has been done with case law, but with media cases where complaints are made around humor and humor that can harm. So what the media institutions have resolved around these cases. And the last thing that I'm doing is best practices. So after identifying the problem, how can we do like best practices? And with this, I'm collaborating with Alberto Godioli, that is a scholar that is doing work on case law in the University of Groningen. And we are doing a workshop with the Columbia Global Freedom of Expression in New York, where we will gather different stakeholders to really try to unpack how to like regulate or protect humor. And I'm in charge of the online part of it. So that's it, that's me. Thanks a lot. Yeah, over to you.